Welcome to 929 Chapters. I'm your host, David Z. Moster, PhD and Rabbi, and today we'll be studying Genesis chapter 4. This is the story of the first murder in history, and it is also the story of the first generations of mankind. Today's video is going to be broken up into 4 parts: a summary and outline of the chapter, select verses in Hebrew and in English, a comment on the chapter, and a photo. So let's begin with the summary and outline of Genesis chapter 4. I broke up this chapter into 6 parts. In the first section, the first man, who we have come to know as Adam, and his wife Eve have 2 sons. The first son, Cain in English, is a farmer, and the second son, Abel in English, is a shepherd. Then, in the second section, Cain kills his brother Hevel. The reason for this is that Cain gave an offering to Yahweh of grains, and Hevel gave an offering to Yahweh of animals, and Yahweh preferred Hevel's offering over Cain's. So Cain was jealous, and he killed his brother Hevel. Then, in the third section, what I call Revelation, Yahweh calls out to Cain and says, "Cain, where's your brother Hevel?" And Cain has that famous line. He says, "Am I my brother's keeper? Am I supposed to know?" Meaning, I have no idea. But Yahweh says, you do have an idea, because I hear the voice of your brother's blood calling out to me from the ground. So I know you killed your brother. Then, in the next section, Yahweh gives a number of punishments to Cain. The first punishment is that he's going to be a wanderer, and he ends up leaving his land and ends up east of Eden in the land of Nod. Another punishment is that it will be very difficult for Cain and his descendants to farm. The ground won't really give him its strength. And then finally, Yahweh gives Cain a sign, probably a metaphorical sign, that is telling people not to kill him or his descendants. Moving on to the 5th section, we get the first of many genealogies in the book of Genesis and the Hebrew Bible as a whole. So let's take a look at this genealogy. Descendants of Cain were Chanoch, Enoch in English, and we have a little tidbit that Cain built the first city in the world and named it after his son Enoch, Chanoch. Then Chanoch has a son Irad, Irad has a son Mechuyael, Mechuyael has a son Metushael, and Metushael has a son named Lemech. Now Lemech had 2 wives. First wife, Ada, gave birth to Yaval and Yuval. Yaval was the father of all tent dwellers, the father of all nomadic shepherds. And Yuval was the father and the creator of music and musical instruments. But Lemech's second wife was named Tzila, and she gave birth to Tuval-Cain. And Tuval-Cain was the father, the creator of metallurgy. Tzila also gave birth to a daughter, the only daughter mentioned in the whole genealogy, named Naamah. So if we work all our way back to Adam, we now know the first 8 generations of mankind. Then the chapter ends on a high note, saying that the first man and his wife Eve gave birth to a son. They had just lost Hevel, so they gave birth to a son named Shet. And then Shet and his wife give birth to a son, Enosh. At this point in time, we are told people started calling out to God in the name Yahweh. This is important because in the first few chapters, there's variation on what to call the deity. The first chapter called him Elohim, other chapters called him Yahweh Elohim, and so at this point in time, we are told that he is referred to as Yahweh alone. Now let's move on to the verses. The verses that I have chosen to read are verses 8 to 12, the story of the first murder, and then how Yahweh finds out about it, and then begins to punish Cain. So let's read it inside. Vayomer Cain el Hevel achiv, and Cain said to Hevel his brother. We don't know really what he said, but for that, stay tuned for the comment. Vayihi biyotem basadeh, and it was when they were in the field. Vayakam Cain el Hevel, and Cain rose up against Hevel achiv, his brother, vayahargehu, and he killed him. Vayomer Adonai el Cain, and Yahweh said to Cain, Ei Hevel achicha, where is Hevel your brother? Vayomer, and he said, Lo yadati, hashomer achi anochi? I do not know, am I my brother's watchman or keeper? Vayomer, and he said, meaning Yahweh said, Ma asita, what have you done? Kol demei achicha tzoakim alai min ha'adama. The voice of your brother's blood is calling out to me from the ground. V'ata, and now, arurata min ha'adama. You are cursed from the ground. Asher patzta et piha lakachat et demei achicha miyadecha, which opened its mouth to take the blood of your brother from your hands. Ki ta'avod et ha'adama, when you work the ground, lo tosef tet kocha lach, it will not continue to give its strength to you. Na v'nad tia ba'aretz, you are going to be a wanderer and a mover in the land. And notice that Nud is like the land of Nod, where Cain ends up. Okay, let's move on to the comment. And the comment today is about verse 8. Let's read verse 8 one more time and just focus on what's missing. Vayomer Cain el Hevel achiv, and Cain said to Hevel his brother, Vayihi biyotem basadeh, vayakam Cain el Hevel achiv vayahargehu. And it was when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Hevel, and he killed him. But wait, what did Cain say to his brother? Something is missing. Now, in order to figure this out, what you're going to need is a Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. That just means that it was printed in Stuttgart, Germany. So this book, even though you can't get it for free online, I'll have a link to it on Amazon. What this book does is it not only gives you the text of the entire Hebrew Bible, but down at the bottom it gives you something called a critical apparatus. And what that means is it tells you what manuscripts have different versions of the Hebrew Bible. Because, every time a manuscript was copied, of course there were going to be some mistakes. A copyist would either accidentally add something, or intentionally add something, or accidentally omit something, or intentionally omit something. So there were always going to be changes. So I actually have the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia on my computer, and we can take a look. So if you look at the word achiv here, you'll notice that there's a little a. What that tells you is to go down to the footnote. The footnotes in the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia are actually in Latin, but there's a helpful key, and I have a link to it on my website for you to download in case you don't read Latin. So what it tells us is that multiple manuscripts and editions here have an interval. What that means is that many texts just have a blank space at this point. Why do they have this blank space? Perhaps it's to insert what we have in the Samaritan Pentateuch, and that little squiggly sign is a sign for the Samaritans, the Greek Pentateuch, which is also known as the Septuagint, the Syriac version, and also the Latin Vulgate version written by Jerome. In these manuscripts, what we see are these extra words, Nelcha Hasadeh. Let us go on to the field. Let us go out to the field. And it also tells us to see a Targum called Pseudo-Jonathan, which we'll see in a bit. And we can actually see this in the texts themselves. Here we have the Samaritan Pentateuch, and it says, Vayomer Cain el Hevel achiv, and Cain said to his brother Hevel, Nelcha hasadeh, let us go to the field. Now, if you want to actually see this in the Samaritan Pentateuch, the original manuscripts itself, you can take a look at my website, 929chapters.com, where I have a link to the Samaritan Pentateuch, the oldest version, and you'll see it in the original Paleo-Hebrew script in the Samaritan style. We can also see it in the Old Greek, the Septuagint, where we have the words, Dielthomen eis to pedion. Let us go out to the field. And then, in some English translations, such as the New Revised Standard Version, an updated version of the King James Bible, what we have here is the translation, Cain said to his brother Abel, let us go out to the field. Now, remember when the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia told us to look at Targum Pseudo-Jonathan? And here I'm showing it to you in the critical apparatus. The Targum Pseudo-Jonathan was written anywhere between the 4th to 8th centuries of the Common Era. And it's a Targum, so that means it's a translation of the Bible into Aramaic. The word Targum means a translation. So here what we're looking at is the text of the Hebrew Bible on the left-hand side of your screen. And then over here in the Aramaic of Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, what we have here are the words Ita v'nefuk tarvinan livara. Let the two of us go out into the field. And you can see it here in the English, come, let the two of us go out to the field. Now this is really interesting because the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan was a Jewish translation of the Bible, and it comes from rabbinic circles. Really, the Jewish texts of the Hebrew Bible don't have those two words. However, the non-Jewish texts, or texts adopted by non-Jews, do have those words. So this is really interesting that Targum Pseudo-Jonathan has this, and it raises questions. Where and how did Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, the author or the authors who wrote it, come to figure out that the words are Nelcha hasadeh, let us go to the field? Now, on a side note, what I want you to notice here is look how long the verse is in the Bible, Genesis 4:8. And now look how long Targum Pseudo-Jonathan is on this one verse. This is the Aramaic, and now I'm going to show you how long it is in English. Now, Targum Pseudo-Jonathan was a midrashic targum. That meant that he liked to insert text into the translation of the Bible to explain some textual problems. So in our case, the problem is, what did Cain say to Hevel? According to Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, Cain said a lot to Hevel. They actually had a whole conversation about whether God exists or not, and whether God is righteous or not. And if you're interested in actually seeing what the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan has, take a look at my website, 929chapters.com, on this chapter where I have the entire text of the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. Now, what should we we make of all this? I think there are two approaches here to understanding what's going on in these manuscripts of the biblical text. The first approach is that the words Nelcha HaSadeh were intentionally added by manuscripts such as the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch in order to solve a textual problem. However, the problem with this approach is that why would an original author of Genesis have said, "and Cain said to his brother," and then not mentioned anything? It really just doesn't make any sense. So the second alternative answer is that this was accidentally omitted in some texts, mainly the texts that would eventually become the Masoretic and Rabbinic Hebrew Bible. And this is the approach I think makes most sense. And so really, if we were to find an original Genesis, if such a thing would ever be found, I think it probably would include the words Nelcha HaSadeh. Okay, so that's it for the comment today. Let's move on to part 4, the photo. The public domain photo I found today and linked to our chapter concerns verse 17. Cain founded a city and named the city after his son Hanoch. And what we see here is some nice urban sprawl of a city. Okay, that does it for today. I would like to point out that if you're interested, on my website, 929chapters.com, I have a nice discussion of who really built the first city. According to the text that we have, Cain built the first city and named it Hanoch. But some 19th century scholars suggested that actually Hanoch built the first city and named it after his son Etrog. And the reason for that is that in Mesopotamia, the first city was called Eridu, which sounds very similar to Etrog. And also, no one's ever heard of a city called Hanoch. It doesn't exist in the Bible. It doesn't exist in the ancient Near Eastern texts or archaeology. So perhaps, maybe, actually Hanoch built the first city and named it Etrog, Eridu. Also, I would like to point out an unsponsored plug for an excellent book, How to Read the Bible by James Kugel, now 10 years old. And in this Bible, in the chapter on Cain and Abel, what he does is he gives an excellent overview of some scholarship about the story of Cain and Hevel. And basically, it's not about Cain murdering his brother Hevel. That's not really the main point of the story. The main point of the story is to teach you that there's a tribe in the east called the Cainites. And the Cainites are very, very vengeful. They'll come after you if you kill one of them. So if you want this book, I'll have a link to it in the description below, but you can also get it from any library. That does it for today. Be sure to check out my website, 929chapters.com, for some of the links regarding the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint. Also, be sure to follow me on social media. That's academia, that's Twitter, that's Instagram. And I hope you join me for Genesis chapter 5.